December 23, 1924. Eleanor Whitmore had been waiting 30 years for this moment. The man bleeding out in her barn was Thomas Creed, the butcher of Willow Creek, the ghost who killed her parents, her brother, and left her for dead when she was 16. She could let him bleed, watch the snow turn red, let the wolves finish what the bullets started. Instead, she saved his life. For 3 days she cleaned his wounds, fed him broth, and listened to him mumble names in his fevered dreams. Names of people he'd killed, including her maiden name, Campbell. He never recognized her face, but she remembered every scar on his hands. What Eleanor didn't know was that the marshal hunting Thomas was his son, and that son was riding hard through the blizzard, following blood in the snow, straight to her door. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hoofbeats came like thunder through the storm. Eleanor's weathered hands froze over the wound dressing as the sound cut through the howling wind. 3 sharp raps, deliberate, authoritative, the kind of knock that demanded answers. She glanced toward the barn where Thomas Creed lay unconscious in the hay, his breathing shallow but steady. The man who'd haunted her nightmares for 42 years was now completely at her mercy, and someone was at her door in the middle of a Dakota blizzard. "Ma'am?" "Us, Marshal David Creed. I'm tracking a wounded fugitive through this storm." Eleanor's blood turned to ice water. Creed. The same name Thomas had whispered in his delirium alongside the ghosts of his victims. She smoothed her gray hair, steadied her voice, and cracked open the heavy oak door. Wind-driven snow stung her face as she studied the man on her porch. Tall, broad-shouldered, with Thomas's same piercing blue eyes but none of his cruelty. A silver badge caught the lamplight on his coat. Marshal. She kept the door mostly closed, her body blocking his view inside. Terrible night to be out. "Yes, ma'am. I've been following a blood trail for 2 miles. Leads right to your property." His eyes were sharp, searching but respectful. "Man I'm hunting is dangerous. Thomas Creed. You seen anyone come through here?" The irony wasn't lost on her. A Creed asking her to betray a Creed. When? 3, maybe 4 days ago. He's wounded bad, might have sought shelter. Eleanor's mind raced. This young marshal couldn't be more than 30, born years after Willow Creek. He probably grew up believing his father was dead, or maybe that he was some other kind of man entirely. The earnestness in his face, the righteous set to his shoulders. This wasn't the son of a killer. This was a man who believed in justice. "I've been alone out here, Marshal. Storms kept me close to the house." David Creed's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I don't mean to frighten you, but this man, he's killed before. If he's nearby, you're in danger." If only you knew, Eleanor thought, remembering 16-year-old Mary Campbell watching her family's blood soak into Willow Creek soil. What's he done? Bank robbery in Rapid City, shot 2 men in cold blood. David's voice carried the weight of personal conviction. "But that's just the latest. I've been hunting Thomas Creed for 3 years, building a case. He's got crimes stretching back decades that no one's been able to prove. And you can prove them?" Something flickered in the marshal's eyes. Pain, determination, something deeper. "I have to. Justice delayed isn't justice denied. Not when you've got the right man and the evidence to put him away forever." Eleanor studied this earnest young man, who shared his father's eyes but seemed to possess a soul Thomas Creed had never known. "You sound personal invested, Marshal." "Maybe I am." David shifted, snow accumulating on his shoulders. "Mind if I check your barn, just to be thorough?" Every muscle in Eleanor's body tensed. 20 yards away, the most wanted man in 3 states lay unconscious under horse blankets, completely defenseless. She could end this now. Point toward the barn. Watch this decent young marshal arrest his monster father. Let justice finally be served. But then what? David Creed would learn the truth about his father's past, about Willow Creek, about the butchery. It would destroy him. She could see it in his face, the way he carried himself with such moral certainty. Finding out he was the son of a mass murderer would break something fundamental inside him. "Marshal, it's just an old barn, nothing but hay and my milk cow. But if it'll put your mind at ease..." She stepped aside, her heart hammering against her ribs. David nodded gratefully and trudged through the knee-deep snow toward the barn. Eleanor followed, her mind spinning with possibilities. She could claim Thomas was already dead when she found him. She could— The barn door creaked open. David's lantern cast long shadows across the hay bales, the empty stalls, "Just like you said, ma'am. Nothing here." Eleanor blinked in confusion, then realized what had happened. The storm had been raging for days, piling snow against the barn's north wall. Thomas wasn't in his usual spot. He'd dragged himself deeper into the shadows, probably half delirious from pain and fever. "Sorry to have troubled you," David said, turning back toward her. "But if you do see anything, anyone, you get yourself to town immediately. Don't try to help, don't try to reason with him. Thomas Creed is the kind of evil that wears a human face." Eleanor nodded, tasting the bitter irony. "I understand, Marshal." As David Creed mounted his horse and disappeared into the blizzard, Eleanor stood in her doorway watching his lantern light fade into the storm. She'd just protected the man who destroyed her life from the son who would never forgive himself for sharing that monster's blood. The question that would haunt her through the long night was simple: why? Ready for Chapter 2? Drop A in the comments if you're dying to know what Eleanor discovers about Thomas that changes everything. And don't forget to follow for daily updates. Eleanor closed the door and leaned against it, her legs trembling like autumn leaves. The silence that followed David Creed's departure felt heavier than the storm itself, a weight that pressed against her chest until each breath became a conscious effort. Why? The question echoed through the drafty rooms of her homestead as she moved through the familiar motions of survival. She fed more wood to the dying fire, her movements mechanical, muscle memory guiding hands that had performed these same tasks for 30 years. The flames caught and danced, casting writhing shadows on walls that had witnessed her transformation from hopeful bride to bitter recluse. This house had been meant for two. She'd scrubbed these floors on her knees in 1894, a 28-year-old woman preparing for a husband who'd answered her carefully worded advertisement in the Denver Post. Henry Morrison, a rancher from Colorado who'd promised her a life of quiet companionship and modest comfort. She'd written letters by candlelight, crafting responses that painted her as younger, prettier, more accomplished at cooking and sewing than she truly was. White lies that felt necessary for a woman already approaching spinsterhood. Eleanor traced her finger along the windowsill, feeling the worn groove she'd carved there during the first winter of waiting. One mark for each week Henry didn't come. By spring, the wood was scarred with 23 small cuts, 23 weeks of checking the horizon for a man who'd taken her $50 dowry and vanished like morning mist. The shame had been unbearable at first. Deadwood was small enough that everyone knew about the mail-order bride who'd been abandoned before her wedding day. The pitying looks at church, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered Morrison's general store, the gradual realization that she'd become a cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about trusting strangers. But shame was an easier burden than the truth she'd never told anyone. Eleanor walked to her bedroom and knelt beside the narrow bed, reaching underneath to pull out a wooden box worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside, beneath yellowed letters from Henry Morrison and the faded marriage license that bore only her signature, lay a wanted poster folded so many times the creases had become permanent scars. Thomas Creed, $500 reward, wanted for murder. The face staring back at her was younger, harder, but unmistakably the same man currently bleeding in her barn. She'd torn this poster from the wall of the sheriff's office in Willow Creek, Montana in 1882, 2 days after watching this man put bullets in her father, her mother, and her younger brother Samuel during a robbery gone wrong. Mary Campbell had died in Willow Creek. Eleanor Whitmore had been born during the 3-day journey to Deadwood, a new name for a girl whose family lay in unmarked graves because the town had burned down around their bodies. She'd built this life on the foundation of that lie, telling anyone who asked that she'd come from Denver, that her family was dead from influenza, that she'd always been alone. The advertisement to Henry Morrison hadn't been about love or even companionship. It had been about disappearing completely into the role of someone's wife, becoming so thoroughly absorbed into another person's story that Mary Campbell's ghosts could never find her. But ghosts, Eleanor had learned, were patient hunters. She returned the poster to its hiding place and walked to the kitchen, where she began preparing a pot of broth. Her hands moved steadily, chopping carrots, dicing onions, adding herbs, while her mind wrestled with an impossible equation. In the barn lay the man who'd stolen everything that mattered to her. In the storm rode his son, a decent man whose world would shatter if he learned his father's true nature. Through the kitchen window, she could see the barn's dark silhouette against the white fury of the blizzard. Somewhere in that darkness, Thomas Creed clung to life by threads she could cut at any moment. A pillow over his face, an extra dose of laudanum, simply walking away and letting the cold finish what David Creed's bullet had started. 42 years she'd dreamed of this moment. 42 years of imagining the look in Thomas Creed's eyes when he realized who she was, what he'd taken from her. In those dreams, he'd beg for mercy she'd never grant. Justice would finally balance the scales that had been broken since 1882. But David Creed's earnest face haunted those fantasies now. The way he'd spoken about his father, not with love, but with the grim determination of a man seeking to right wrongs he didn't fully understand. How long had he been hunting Thomas? How many sleepless nights had he spent building his case, believing he was serving justice rather than pursuing his own blood? Eleanor ladled broth into a bowl and reached for her heavy coat. The wind howled against the windows like something wild and hungry, but she barely heard it. Her attention was focused on the barn, where two men's fates hung in the balance, one who deserved to die and one who deserved to live in ignorance. The question followed her into the storm. Why had she protected him? Perhaps, she thought, as snow stung her face, she was about to find out. The barn door fought against her as Eleanor pushed through the drifted snow. The bowl of broth clutched against her chest like a shield. Inside, the familiar scent of hay and leather mingled with something else, the metallic tang of blood and the sour smell of infection. Thomas Creed lay exactly where she'd left him, his breathing ragged but steady. In the lamplight, his face looked gaunt, older than she remembered from the wanted poster. Gray threaded through his dark hair, and deep lines mapped decades of hard living around his eyes. This wasn't the vital, terrifying figure who'd ridden into Willow Creek 42 years ago. This was just a man, wounded, vulnerable, dependent on her mercy. Eleanor set the broth aside and checked his bandages. The bleeding had stopped, but fever had taken hold. His skin burned under her touch, and he muttered incoherently in his sleep, fragments of names and places that might have been confessions if she could piece them together. "Water," he rasped suddenly, his eyes fluttering open. They were the same piercing blue as his son's, but dulled now by pain and fever. "Please." She helped him drink, her hands steady despite the storm raging in her chest. He didn't recognize her. How could he? The frightened girl who'd hidden behind the grain barrels in her father's store bore little resemblance to the weathered woman tending his wounds. 42 years had carved their own map on her face, just as they had on his. "My horse," he mumbled, struggling to sit up. "Need to—" "They're coming." "Your horse is dead," Eleanor said quietly, froze in the storm. "And they already came." Thomas's eyes sharpened, focusing on her with effort. "Who?" "A marshal. David Creed." She watched his face carefully, looking for some flicker of recognition, some sign that the name meant something to him. "Said he was hunting you." The change was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas's jaw tightened, and something like regret flickered across his features. Not fear, she would have expected fear, but regret, deep and bitter. "How long?" His voice was barely a whisper. 3 days since I found you. He said he's been hunting you for years." Thomas closed his eyes, and for a moment Eleanor thought he'd fallen unconscious again. Then he spoke, so quietly she had to lean closer to hear. "Good boy, David. Always was too good for his own sake." Eleanor's breath caught. "You know him." "Know him?" Thomas laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I raised him. Tried to, anyway, before his mother took him away, before she learned what I really was." His eyes opened, meeting hers with startling clarity. "He thinks he's hunting justice, doesn't know he's hunting his father." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. All her careful assumptions crumbled in an instant. David Creed wasn't pursuing his father out of ignorance. He was pursuing him because he was his father, because he knew, somewhere deep down, that the blood in his veins came from a killer. "He's going to keep coming," Thomas continued, his voice growing weaker. Won't stop until he finds me. Can't say I blame him. Boy's got a conscience I never had. Eleanor stared down at the man who'd destroyed her family, trying to reconcile the monster from her nightmares with this broken figure speaking of his son with something that almost sounded like pride. Why are you telling me this? Because you're going to have to choose. Thomas's eyes fixed on hers with unsettling intensity. When he comes back, and he will come back, you're going to have to decide whether to give me up, whether to let a son put his own father in the ground. You don't know anything about choice, Eleanor said, the words tasting like ash. You took every choice away from my family in Willow Creek. She hadn't meant to say it. The words escaped before she could stop them, 42 years of buried rage finally breaking the surface. Thomas went very still, his fevered eyes searching her face with new attention. Willow Creek, he repeated slowly. 1882, the Campbell store. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. After all these years of imagining this moment, she wasn't prepared for the quiet recognition in his voice. No fear, no defiance, just a tired acknowledgement of old sins finally coming home. You were behind the grain barrels, Thomas said. Little girl with brown braids. I saw you watching. He paused, studying her weathered features. Mary Campbell. You grew up. The barn seemed to shrink around them. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the air had gone still and heavy. Eleanor felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not the satisfaction she'd dreamed of, but a hollow ache that threatened to consume her entirely. Thomas Creed remembered Willow Creek. He remembered her family. He remembered the terrified girl who'd watched her world end. And now, 42 years later, that girl finally held his life in her hands. Eleanor stood frozen in the lamplight, her hands still gripping the empty water cup. The weight of recognition hung between them like a blade, sharp, inevitable, and ready to cut deep. She had imagined this moment countless times, but never like this. Never with him weak and defenseless. Never with the specter of his son haunting the edges of their reckoning. Mary Campbell, Thomas said again, his voice barely above a whisper. I wondered what happened to you. Figured you died in the fire with the rest of the town. She set the cup down with trembling fingers, not trusting herself to speak. The barn walls seemed to press closer, 42 years of careful distance collapsing into this single suffocating moment. The girl behind the grain barrels. He'd seen her all these years. She'd told herself she'd been invisible, that her survival had been pure chance. But he'd known she was there. He'd let her live. Why? The words scraped against her throat like broken glass. Thomas closed his eyes, his breathing labored. You were just a child. Couldn't have been more than 14, 15. Had these big brown eyes, scared as a cornered rabbit. He paused, wincing as pain shot through his wounded side. Some lines you don't cross, even when you're already damned. Eleanor backed away from him, her spine hitting the barn wall. The rough wood bit through her coat, grounding her in the present even as her mind reeled backward to that terrible day. She could smell the gunpowder again, hear her mother's scream cut short, see her father's hands clutching his chest as blood bloomed across his white shirt. You killed them, she whispered. My whole family. Papa, Mama, Samuel. You took everything. I know. His admission carried no excuses, no justifications, just flat acceptance of an unforgivable truth. Bank was supposed to be empty. Your father fought back when he should have just given me the money. He was protecting us. The words came out as a snarl. You walked into our store, demanded our money, and when he tried to keep his family safe, you murdered him for it. Thomas's eyes opened, meeting hers with something she couldn't name. Not quite regret, not quite defiance. Yes, I did. The simple acknowledgement hit harder than any excuse would have. Eleanor pressed her palms against the wall behind her, needing something solid to hold on to as the careful structure of her hatred wavered. She'd spent decades nurturing her rage, feeding it stories of Thomas Creed as a monster who killed without thought or conscience. But monsters didn't remember the faces of children they'd spared. Monsters didn't speak of their sons with weary pride. You don't get to be human, she said desperately, as if speaking the words could make them true. Not after what you did. Not after destroying your life? Thomas shifted slightly, grimacing with pain. After turning you into this? A woman living alone in the middle of nowhere, afraid to let anyone get close enough to hurt you again? Eleanor flinched. How could he see so clearly what she'd spent 30 years hiding from herself? The mail-order husband who never came, Thomas continued, his voice growing weaker. That wasn't about love, was it, Mary? That was about disappearing, about becoming someone else's problem so you wouldn't have to be yourself anymore. Stop. The word came out broken, barely recognizable as her own voice. I've been running my whole life, Thomas said, ignoring her plea. From what I did, from who I am, from the boy I raised before I ruined him too. But you've been hiding, and hiding's just another kind of running. Eleanor slid down the wall until she was sitting in the hay, her knees drawn up to her chest like a child. The lamp flame guttered in a draft, sending shadows dancing across the barn walls. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside, everything had gone unnaturally quiet. David doesn't know, she said finally, about Willow Creek, about what you really are. No. And if you're smart, you'll keep it that way. Thomas's breathing was growing more labored, fever burning through him like wildfire. Boy spent his whole life trying to be better than his father. Learning the truth about Willow Creek would break something in him that can't be fixed. Eleanor stared at this dying man who'd haunted her nightmares for 4 decades. The enemy who'd given her purpose, who'd justified every cold morning alone, every night spent checking and rechecking the locks on her doors. Without him to hate, what was left of Mary Campbell? What was left of Eleanor Whitmore? I could end this, she whispered, right now. A pillow over your face, and 42 years of justice finally served. Thomas managed a weak smile. Yes, you could, but then David would never know. Would spend the rest of his life hunting a ghost. Maybe that's kinder than knowing the ghost was his father. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice settling over her like snow. The girl who'd lost everything in Willow Creek demanded vengeance. The woman who just looked into David Creed's earnest face demanded mercy. She was no longer certain they were the same person. The silence stretched between them, until Eleanor could hear nothing but the storm's fury and the ragged rhythm of Thomas's breathing. She remained huddled against the barn wall, staring at this man who'd just torn apart 42 years of carefully constructed purpose with a few quiet words. You want to know the worst part? She said finally, her voice hollow as wind through empty rooms. I was grateful. Thomas's eyes found hers through the lamplight, waiting. After Willow Creek burned, after they buried what was left, I was grateful to be alone. No more responsibility for anyone but myself. No more watching people I loved suffer. The words felt like poison in her mouth. I told myself I was mourning, but really I was relieved. And that relief scared me more than your bullets ever did. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest, remembering. So I came here. Became Eleanor Whitmore. Built a life around being abandoned, because being unwanted felt safer than choosing to be alone. Henry Morrison was just convenient. A reason to hide that didn't make me a monster. Thomas said nothing, but his breathing had grown shallower, more labored. The fever was consuming him from the inside, and Eleanor realized with crystalline clarity that time was running out. For justice, for vengeance, for truth, all of it balanced on the edge of his next breath. But I was a monster anyway, she continued, the confession spilling out of her like water from a broken dam. Because part of me was glad Samuel died quick. Glad I didn't have to watch him grow up broken. Glad I didn't have to spend the rest of my life wondering if I was strong enough to keep him safe. The lamp flame flickered, and in the dancing shadows she could see her brother's face, 15 years old, kind eyes like their father's, shot down while reaching for their mother's hand. He'd been trying to protect her too, just like Papa, just like everyone always tried to protect everyone else, until protection became just another word for failure. You think you broke me, Eleanor whispered. But I was already breaking had been since the day I realized I was different from other girls. Harder, colder, more willing to survive than to save anyone else. She laughed bitterly. You just gave me an excuse to stop pretending otherwise. Thomas struggled to speak, his voice barely audible. Mary, don't. The sharpness in her tone surprised them both. Don't you dare try to absolve me. I've spent 4 decades perfecting my hate for you because it was easier than admitting I hated myself more." She pushed herself to her feet, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "You know what I did after Henry Morrison disappeared? I was relieved. Told everyone I was heartbroken, played the abandoned bride perfectly, but inside I was celebrating. Because I'd found the perfect reason to never trust anyone again, never risk caring about anyone again." The storm outside seemed to intensify, matching the tempest in her chest. Through gaps in the barn walls, snow swirled in ghostly patterns, and Eleanor found herself thinking of all the winters she'd spent alone. All the meals cooked for one, all the conversations held with shadows and silence. "And your son," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Good, decent David who's been hunting his father for God knows how long. You want to know why I didn't turn you over to him immediately?" Thomas's eyes tracked her movements, fever bright but still alert. "Because I recognized that look in his eyes. The same look Samuel used to get when he'd find injured birds and try to nurse them back to health." Eleanor stopped pacing, facing Thomas directly. "David's trying to heal something broken in himself by bringing you to justice, and I couldn't stand the thought of being the one to break that hope." She knelt beside him again, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead, despite the barn's bitter cold. "But here's what you don't understand, Thomas Creed. David's not hunting you because he's your son. He's hunting you because he's not you, because somewhere in that boy's soul he knows the difference between justice and vengeance, between duty and hate." Thomas's hand moved weakly as if trying to reach for something. He's better than both of us," Eleanor finished. "Yes, and that's why this choice is killing me." She looked down at the man who'd shaped her life without meaning to, who'd given her both purpose and emptiness in equal measure. His breathing was becoming increasingly irregular, and she knew the fever would claim him soon regardless of what she decided. "I spent 42 years wanting you dead," she said quietly. "But I spent 42 years becoming someone who doesn't deserve to see justice served. Someone who chose isolation over love, safety over courage, hate over healing." Outside, the storm began to show the first signs of weakening. Dawn was still hours away, but something in the wind's voice had changed. By morning, the world would be transformed, buried under snow but clean, ready for whatever came next. The question that remained was whether either of them would live to see it. Thomas's hand fell back to the straw with a soft thud, and for a moment Eleanor thought he'd finally slipped away. Then his chest rose in a shuddering breath, and his eyes opened with startling clarity, the kind that sometimes came just before the end. "You're wrong about one thing, Mary Campbell," he whispered, each word a visible effort. "David's not hunting me because he's better than me. He's hunting me because I taught him to." Eleanor frowned, leaning closer despite herself. "What do you mean?" A bitter smile ghosted across Thomas's cracked lips. "You think I just abandoned that boy? Left him and his mother to fend for themselves?" He coughed, flecks of blood staining the corners of his mouth. "I stayed in their lives for 8 years. 8 years of trying to be the father he deserved instead of the killer I was." The words hit Eleanor like cold water. Everything she'd assumed about David's noble pursuit, his innate goodness, his natural sense of justice, it all wavered under this new information. "I taught him to read with wanted posters," Thomas continued, his voice gaining a fevered intensity. "Told him they were stories about bad men who needed to be caught. Made it a game, spotting the differences between right and wrong, justice and lawlessness. He loved those lessons. Bright boy, always asking questions." Eleanor's stomach clenched. "You're lying." "Am I?" "You've met him. Seen that earnest face, that determination to do right no matter the cost. You think that just happens naturally?" Thomas's laugh turned into a cough that racked his entire frame. "I created that. Every moral compass that boy has, every sleepless night he's spent hunting outlaws, I built that into him piece by piece, hoping it would somehow balance the scales for what I'd done." The barn seemed to tilt around Eleanor. She pressed her palms against the rough floorboards, trying to anchor herself as the revelation rewrote everything she thought she understood. David's pursuit wasn't noble justice. It was a father's conditioning. His goodness wasn't innate. It was manufactured by a killer seeking absolution. When David was 12, Thomas whispered. He asked me why I knew so much about outlaws, why I could always predict how they'd think, where they'd run, and I saw it in his eyes, that first flicker of suspicion. So I told him I'd been a lawman once. Told him I understood criminals because I'd spent my life hunting them. Eleanor felt sick. Another lie. The biggest one of all. Because that night, I realized what I was doing to him. Turning him into my own personal confessor, my walking penance. So I left. Figured it was better to let him think his father was a coward than to let him learn his father was a killer. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. David's dedication wasn't about justice. It was about proving himself worthy of a father who'd vanished without explanation. His relentless pursuit of outlaws wasn't noble calling. It was a son desperately trying to become the man he thought his father had been. You destroyed him too, Eleanor breathed. Just like you destroyed my family. Just like you destroyed me. You took that boy's capacity for love and twisted it into something else entirely. Thomas's eyes found hers, and in them she saw not the remorse she'd expected, but something far worse, satisfaction. And he's been the best lawman in 3 territories because of it. Saved more lives than I ever took. The guilt I gave him made him better than nature ever could have. Eleanor recoiled as if he'd struck her. You're proud of what you did to him? I gave him purpose, direction, a reason to be something more than his father's son. Thomas's voice was fading, but his conviction remained strong. Without me to run from, what would David Creed have become? A shopkeeper, a farmer, some ordinary man living an ordinary life? A happy man. The words tore from Eleanor's throat. A whole man. Someone who could love without measuring it against some impossible standard of goodness. But Thomas was shaking his head weakly. Happiness is for people who never learned what the world really is. David knows. He's seen the darkness because I showed it to him, and now he stands guard against it. That's not destruction, Mary. That's purpose. Eleanor stared at him in horror, finally understanding the depth of his arrogance. Thomas Creed didn't just kill people. He consumed them, turned their love, their loyalty, their very goodness into weapons for his own twisted sense of righteousness. He'd murdered her family and called it necessity. He'd abandoned his son and called it mercy. He'd shaped a boy's entire moral foundation around a lie and called it purpose. You really believe that? She whispered. You actually think you did him a favor? Thomas's smile was the most terrible thing she'd ever seen. I know I did. Outside, the storm was definitely weakening now, but inside the barn, Eleanor felt as if the real blizzard was just beginning. Eleanor stood frozen in the lamplight, staring down at Thomas Creed's satisfied smile as the full weight of his twisted philosophy crashed over her. The storm outside had weakened to occasional gusts, but the silence felt more threatening than any howling wind. In a few hours, dawn would break. David would return, and she would have to look into the eyes of a man whose entire life had been built on the carefully constructed lies of the killer lying at her feet. You're insane, she whispered, but even as she spoke the words, she could see the horrible logic threading through Thomas's manipulations. David's rigid moral code, his relentless pursuit of justice, his inability to simply let sleeping dogs lie. It all made sense now, not as nobility, but as programming. Thomas's breathing had grown so shallow she had to strain to hear it. Sanity's just another word for accepting things as they are instead of making them better. I made David better. You made him broken. Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip in the cold air. Just like you made me broken. Just like everyone you touch becomes broken. But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her voice. Because David wasn't broken, was he? He was competent, dedicated, respected. Everything she might have become if she'd chosen purpose over hiding, action over paralysis. The comparison burned like acid in her chest. Tell me something, Mary, Thomas said, his words coming slower now, each one a visible effort. In all these years of hating me, what did you build? What did you create? Who did you save? The questions hit their mark with surgical precision. Eleanor thought of her empty house, her barren garden, her life measured out in silent meals and solitary winters. She'd preserved herself perfectly, like a flower pressed between the pages of a book, technically intact but drained of all color and life. "I survived," she said weakly. "David saved dozens of lives, brought killers to justice, made whole towns safer just by passing through." Thomas's eyes were closing, but his voice carried a terrible certainty. "Which one of you honored your family's memory better? The girl who hid from the world, or the boy who learned to protect it?" Eleanor wanted to scream, to strike out, to do anything but acknowledge the grain of truth buried in his poison. Because he was right, wasn't he? David had taken his pain and transformed it into purpose, while she'd taken hers and nursed it like a sick child, feeding it and tending it until it became the only thing in her life that felt real. "But it's all based on a lie," she said desperately. When he learns the truth, he'll have a choice." Thomas's words were barely a whisper now. He can let it break him, or he can decide that the good he's done matters more than the man who taught him to do it. That's not something I can control anymore. It's all his now. Eleanor pressed her hands to her temples, feeling a headache building behind her eyes. Outside, the wind had dropped to almost nothing, and she could hear the settling silence that meant the storm was finally dying. Soon David would dig himself out and start looking for his father's trail. Soon she would have to decide whether to hand over a dying man or let him slip away into whatever came after. "You want to know what the worst part is?" she asked, the words surprising her as they emerged. "Part of me envies him. Part of me wishes someone had given me a purpose like that, even if it was built on lies, because at least then I'd have something to show for all these years besides an empty house and a garden that won't grow." Thomas's eyes opened one last time, focusing on her with something that might have been compassion, if it had come from anyone else. "It's not too late, Mary. The choice David's going to face, you're facing it right now. You can let this break you further, or you can decide that survival isn't enough anymore. And what would you have me do? Forgive you? Find peace?" "I'd have you choose," he whispered. "For once in your life, choose something other than safety. Choose justice, choose mercy, choose vengeance. I don't care which. But choose it because it's right, not because it's safe." Eleanor stared down at him, this dying man who'd haunted her nightmares and shaped her days without her permission. His chest barely moved now, each breath a victory against the fever consuming him from within. She could end it here, press her hands over his mouth and nose, and let him slip away, knowing she'd finally taken back the power he'd stolen from her 42 years ago. Or she could walk back to the house, make coffee, and wait for David to arrive so she could watch a good man learn that everything he'd built his life on was a lie. Either way, the girl who'd hidden behind those grain barrels was about to die as surely as if Thomas had put a bullet in her all those years ago. Eleanor knelt beside Thomas in the dying lamplight, her hand hovering inches from his throat. One simple motion, just enough pressure, just long enough, and 42 years of nightmares would finally end. The fever was already doing most of the work. She would merely be hastening what was inevitable. But as she watched his labored breathing, she realized the choice Thomas had forced upon her was far more complex than simple murder. This wasn't about ending his life. It was about choosing who she would become when his life ended. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the silence like a blade. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. David was early. The storm had cleared faster than expected, and now she could hear him calling out as he approached the house. Her time had run out before she'd made any choice at all. "Mary." Thomas's voice was barely a whisper, but his eyes had found hers with startling clarity. "Whatever you do, don't let him become like you." The words hit her like a physical blow. In the distance, David's voice grew closer, calling for Eleanor Whitmore, asking if she was safe. Soon he would check the barn. Soon he would see his father lying in the straw, and everything would change forever. Eleanor stood on unsteady legs, her mind racing. She could call out now, bring David running, let justice take its course. Or she could stay silent, let Thomas slip away in the next few minutes, and spare his son the truth that would shatter everything he believed about himself. But as David's footsteps approached the barn, Eleanor realized there was a third choice, one that terrified her more than either alternative. She could tell David the truth, all of it. Not just that Thomas Creed was his father, but who Eleanor really was, what Thomas had done to her family, how his entire moral foundation had been built on manipulation and lies. She could strip away every comfortable illusion and force them both to face the raw, unvarnished reality of what they'd become. The barn door scraped open, and David stepped inside, snow still clinging to his coat, concern etched across his features. His eyes took in the scene: Eleanor kneeling beside a dying stranger, the makeshift sickbed, the fever-bright atmosphere of the small space. "Ma'am, I saw the light and wanted to make sure." His voice trailed off as his gaze fell on Thomas's face. Eleanor watched the recognition dawn slowly. First confusion, then disbelief, then a terrible understanding that seemed to drain all the color from David's features. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped halfway, trembling. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." Thomas's eyes opened at the sound of his son's voice. For a moment, father and son stared at each other across the lamplight, and Eleanor saw the weight of 8 years of separation, of lies, of carefully constructed mythology crumbling in real time. "Hello, David," Thomas said quietly. The simple greeting shattered something in David's chest. Eleanor could see it happening. The collapse of the heroic father he'd imagined, the lawman who'd taught him right from wrong, the man whose disappearance had driven him to become everything he thought his father would have wanted. "You're—" David's voice broke. "You're Thomas Creed, the outlaw, the killer I've been hunting." Yes. The single word contained no apology, no explanation, no comfort, just acknowledgement of a truth that rewrote David's entire history in one devastating stroke. Eleanor saw her moment, the precise instant when she could choose silence and let the two men work through their reunion alone. But Thomas's words echoed in her mind. "Don't let him become like you, David," she said quietly, and both men turned toward her. "There's more you need to know." Thomas's eyes widened in understanding, but he was too weak to protest. David looked at her with the desperate hope of a drowning man reaching for a rope, and Eleanor realized she was about to either save him or pull him under completely. "My name isn't Eleanor Whitmore," she began, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. "It's Mary Campbell. And your father killed my family when I was 16 years old." The words fell into the silent barn like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything that had seemed solid just moments before. David's face went white, then red, then white again as the implications crashed over him. "The Campbell Massacre," he whispered. "Willow Creek. That was him." Eleanor's voice gained strength as she spoke, 42 years of silence finally breaking like a dam. "I was the only survivor. I've been hiding from the world ever since, and he's been hiding from the law, and now here we all are, in a barn in the middle of nowhere, with all our secrets finally bleeding out into the open." David's hand completed its journey to his gun, drawing it with the smooth precision of a man who'd made the motion 1,000 times. But his eyes were the eyes of a lost boy, looking back and forth between the father who'd shaped his life and the woman who was systematically destroying every foundation he'd built that life upon. "Choose, David," Thomas whispered from the straw. "But choose for yourself, not for me, not for her, for who you want to be when all this is over." The gun trembled in David's hand as he stared between the dying father who had shaped his entire existence and the woman whose family that same father had destroyed. Eleanor could see the war raging behind his eyes. Duty against love, justice against mercy, the man he'd been raised to be against the man he was choosing to become. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by Thomas's labored breathing and the settling creak of the barn. Finally, David's arms slowly lowered, the gun hanging loose at his side. "I can't," he whispered, and Eleanor wasn't sure if he meant he couldn't shoot, or couldn't forgive, or couldn't reconcile the impossible contradictions that had just reshattered his world. Perhaps all three. Thomas's eyes closed, a small smile ghosting across his lips. "Good boy," he breathed, so quietly Eleanor almost missed it. Then his breathing stopped. For a long moment neither Eleanor nor David moved. The man who had haunted both their lives for decades lay still between them, and the silence felt different somehow, lighter, despite the grief and confusion that hung heavy in the air. David holstered his gun with mechanical precision, then slowly removed his hat. "I should arrest you," he said to the still form, but there was no anger left in his voice, only a bone-deep exhaustion that Eleanor recognized in her own soul. "He's beyond that now," she said gently. David's laugh was hollow, bitter. 42 years. I've spent 42 years trying to become worthy of a man who never existed. He looked at Eleanor with eyes that seemed decades older than they had moments before. "And you've spent the same 42 years running from him." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Neither of us really lived, did we? We just survived around the edges of what he did to us." They stood vigil over Thomas's body as dawn broke outside the barn, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a world that looked clean and new, unmarked by the violence and revelations of the night. "What happens now?" David asked finally. Eleanor considered the question. The marshal still had his duty, she supposed. Reports to file, justice to serve, even if it was only the cold justice of paperwork and official records. And she had her empty house waiting, her garden that wouldn't grow, her carefully preserved solitude. But something had shifted during the night. The girl who had hidden behind grain barrels was truly dead now, and the woman who remained felt different somehow. Tired, yes, but not defeated. Grieving, but not broken. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that depends on who we decide to be now that he's gone." David was quiet for a long time, staring at his father's still face. "I don't know how to be anyone else. Being a lawman is all I've ever been. It's who he made me, maybe. But tonight you chose not to shoot a dying man, even though he deserved it. That wasn't who he made you. That was who you chose to be." A tear tracked down David's weathered cheek. "I keep thinking about all the good I thought I was doing. All those outlaws brought to justice. All those people I helped. Was any of it real if it started from a lie?" Eleanor thought about her own years of hiding, of choosing safety over life, of letting fear make all her decisions. The help was real. The people you saved were real. Maybe the question isn't where it came from, but what you do with it now. By full daylight, they had wrapped Thomas in Eleanor's spare blanket and loaded him onto David's horse. They would take him to Deadwood, David said, see him properly buried, file the necessary reports, close the books on Thomas Creed once and for all. As they prepared to leave the homestead, Eleanor took one last look at the house where she had spent 30 years being Eleanor Whitmore. It looked smaller somehow, less like a fortress and more like what it had always been, a hiding place. "You could come with me," David said quietly. "To town, I mean. You don't have to stay out here anymore." Eleanor smiled and realized it was the first genuine smile to cross her face in decades. "No, I don't, do I?" She looked at the garden where nothing had ever grown, then at the horizon where the snow was already beginning to melt. "But I think I'll stay a bit longer, see if I can't finally get something to take root in that stubborn ground." David nodded, understanding passing between them. They had both been shaped by the same man's violence, but they didn't have to be defined by it any longer. As Eleanor watched David ride away toward Deadwood with his father's body, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 42 years, the possibility of a future that belonged entirely to her. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely unknown. She turned back toward the house, but for the first time since 1894, Mary Campbell walked through the front door instead of Eleanor Whitmore.